The idea of death has always captivated me since I was a teenager. I used to wonder if there was anything to feel after passing away, if something existed, and what it felt like. In my early adulthood, I realized my curiosity and started learning more about the topic, but when it came time to choose a career for my future, I chose to become a forensic pathologist. My parents were appalled because no one in my family had ever chosen to pursue such a field. Although my parents didn't agree with my choice, they had no choice but to accept it and support me in following my dream. During my first years as a forensic pathologist, I worked at one of the best-rated hospitals in my city, handling a variety of cases. My mother was a highly successful lawyer, and my father was a professor at one of the most prestigious universities in the state. To be honest, I didn't fully understand where this uncontrollable desire to examine cadavers and inspect organs came from. And looked at innumerable bodies without being repulsed by me. Processing a body was as natural as a chef cutting a steak. Everyone has their specialty, but dealing with children's bodies affected me emotionally because I couldn't understand why life would end just as they were starting to live. It was very challenging to look at a child's lifeless body and study their delicate organs. But it was necessary because families needed that time to grieve and say goodbye without the decomposition process taking away their opportunity. I'm Liz Wilson, and I've worked for many years as a forensic pathologist. However, even after all this time, doing a child's autopsy is still as difficult and painful as the first time. I could go on for a week about all the stories I've heard in my career, but I'll concentrate on one that particularly affected me because it involved children and a paranormal detail that made it unique. That night, my assistant Jazz and I were on duty in the hospital's autopsy suite. We had just finished doing an necropsy on a 50-year-old man who had passed away from cardiovascular disease, and as we were finishing up the report, a porter pushed through the door. Wheeling a stretcher with a body covered in a small sheet, the body of a boy, about 9 years old, was found beneath the white sheet. The porter explained that the boy had died of asphyxiation after playing hide-and-seek with some friends. He had accidentally hidden inside an airtight metal container that had been abandoned in a scrapyard near his home. The door of the container had closed, trapping the boy inside, and he suffocated when the oxygen ran out. The tragedy didn't end there, as two of the boy's friends had also hidden in the same container and met the same end. Their bodies were expected soon, and we were told to process all 3 bodies as soon as possible because their families would be arriving early the following morning to retrieve them. I asked Jazz to start the preliminary examination while I finished suturing the adult male we had just autopsied because I couldn't bring myself to start handling a child's body after we finished the report for the previous body and were ready to examine the boy. Shortly after the arrival of the other 2 children, one was a girl who was about 7 years old, and the other was a little older than the first boy. As with the first case, we were told to conduct their autopsies right away because their grieving families would arrive the following morning, which was an emotionally taxing task for me. I followed the same process as before, assigning Jazz to the initial visual assessments, but this time our supervisor, frustrated by our hesitation, stepped in and insisted that we perform a thorough autopsy on all 3 children. He explained that the police suspected foul play and had requested a detailed report to be ready by the next morning, so there was no way around it. I told Jazz to get the tools ready and place the first boy on the table. Before I started, I followed my ritual of asking the deceased for permission to examine their body. I know some people may find it ridiculous, even mob, but for me, it's a way to show respect for the body when someone passes away. Even so, I think that the body still has dignity, and it is wrong to touch it without permission. All right, little one, I said gently. Let's get you ready so your family can see you and say their goodbyes. The procedure started with the boy's body being stiff, probably from the length of time he had been imprisoned in the container. The rigor mortis made it challenging to undress him for the examination, which was a necessary step. I tried to slowly relax the stiffness by speaking softly and urging the body to move as if it were a living child. To my surprise, the stiffness slightly decreased, a phenomenon I had seen before but had never completely comprehended. After I had him ready, I started the external examination. His mouth hung slightly ape-like, as if he had been gasping for air in his last moments, and his big round eyes were wide open with dilated pupils. At first, I assumed these characteristics were just the product of post-mortem rigidity, but as I turned him to look at his skull, I saw that his expression conveyed fear and desperation. There were no visible signs of bleeding in the container where he was found, ruling out any post-mortem injuries, but I did find something concerning: a blunt force injury on the back of his head. Although the blow had not broken the skin, it was severe enough to have caused significant internal damage. As I came to terms with the fact that the boy had not suffocated while playing a harmless game as I had first thought, but had instead been struck before passing away, my heart sank. The 7-year-old girl was the next body on the table. Her delicate body showed no signs of head injuries, but I could see bruises around her neck, which led me to believe that she had been strangled. This discovery supported my growing suspicion that these kids had not died accidentally. A similar pattern of neck bruising in the third child, who was a little older than the others, indicated that strangulation had occurred again. We worked through the night, completing the exams at around 2 in the morning. The results were definitive. All 3 of the children had been murdered, with their deaths staged to appear to be a tragic accident. None had perished from asphyxiation. After finishing the tests, I prepared my reports for the authorities, going into detail about each observation. In order to review the registry and confirm a suspicion that had been growing in my mind, I decided to take a break. The receptionist was sleeping with her head resting on the desk when I gently woke her up and asked for the logbook. She handed it to me while rubbing her eyes and yawning. I sat down close by and started looking through the entries, and when I realized that my suspicion was correct, the 3 children were siblings. A chill went through me. Returning the logbook to the receptionist, I imagined the unimaginable grief their parents must be going through. As I got closer, I saw Jazz running down the hallway toward me, his face pale with fear. "Doctor," he gasped, "something's not right." I tried to reassure him, saying that his fear was due to exhaustion, but no one was there. "It's late, Jazz. You're tired. Maybe you imagined it." No, he insisted that I wasn't asleep. I could tell he was in distress, so I suggested we grab coffee. We walked to the cafeteria together, and while he appeared to be somewhat calmer, the fear in his eyes persisted after we finished our coffee. In an attempt to divert our attention with light conversation, we went back to the morgue. The hallway leading to the autopsy room was eerily quiet, which added to the uneasiness that had descended upon us both. As we approached the door, we paused and exchanged anxious looks. When we entered, the room was in complete chaos. The instruments we had painstakingly arranged were strewn all over the floor, and the sheets covering the children's bodies were gone. 3 tiny bodies were lying there. They were left motionless on the stretches. but the condition of the room conveyed a different message. "What took place here?" Jazz spoke in a tremulous whisper. The air was heavy, as though the room itself were, and I had no response. After making sure everything was as safe as possible, I felt compelled to speak, but for the first time in my career, I was genuinely afraid. I suggested that we take a short break, and Jazz reluctantly agreed. We then went back to the small staff room nearby, where I lay on the cot and he slumped onto the sofa. I'm not sure how long I had been asleep when I was startled awake by a sound that was faint at first but gradually became clearer. A child's voice, counting as though I were playing hide and seek in 1920. Ready or not, my heart pounded as the evening's memories flooded back. I suddenly sat up, my heart racing in my ears, and as I looked around, I saw that Jazz had left the room. Where could he have gone? When I walked into the hallway, I was surprised to see Mary, one of the night shift nurses. She looked at me with a mixture of confusion and concern, asking, "You know that children aren't allowed in the morgue?" I stared at her, perplexed, because I don't have any kids. I wondered out loud that the sound of my voice wasn't doing much to calm me down. So I stole myself. Mary asked impatiently, "What are you talking about?" "I saw the kids playing hide and seek near the autopsy room. You need to get them out of there." The only children in the morgue were the ones we had autopsied just hours earlier. They aren't my kids. "The only children here are dead," I said. Mary's face went pale, and she prayed quietly under her breath before rushing down the hallway, leaving me to think alone. I went back to the staff room to collect myself, but before I could do so, a shrill scream reverberated through the hallway, making every nerve in my body tense. I hurried toward the sound, afraid of what I might discover, and when I arrived at the morgue, I saw Jez standing. In the entrance, his face was frozen in place, and his wide eyes were focused on something inside the room. I followed his gaze, but at first I didn't notice anything strange. "Jez, what's wrong?" I asked, holding his arm. "They're not dead," he whispered, "Doctor," in a barely audible voice. "I saw them, the children, running and laughing." I shook my head, trying to persuade him that it wasn't possible, but he wouldn't be swayed. "I saw them," he insisted. "I know what I see." Before I could react, a faint sound caught my attention. Soft giggles reverberated from deep within the autopsy room, and my blood ran cold. I nodded, my own fear paralyzing me because there was no longer any doubt that something or someone was in that room. The sounds from the autopsy room became unmistakable objects clattering to the floor, soft giggles, and the unmistakable pitter-patter of small feet. My rational mind fought against the evidence of my senses, but eventually my voice trembled as the laughter grew louder and was joined by the sound of footsteps and objects being moved. Jazz took hold of my arm and vigorously shook his head. "No, doctor, we can't go in there. Whatever's in that room isn't natural." I hesitated, my heart racing, but my professional curiosity and a strong desire to learn made me stay. I told him, "I'll go alone." He didn't object. Instead, he looked relieved, as if the thought of entering that room was too much for him to handle. I took a deep breath and carefully pushed the door open. At first glance, the room looked empty, with the three bodies lying exactly as we had left them, motionless on their stretches. However, the condition of the room was worse than before, with overturned trays and scattered instruments. The children were no longer covered by the sheets, and the air was cold and heavy. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I wasn't alone, and then I heard it again. My breath caught in my throat as I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Quickly turned, but nothing was there. I called out, my voice quivering, but there was only more laughter, accompanied by faint whispers that I couldn't make out, and my legs felt like they were rooted to the floor, fear holding me in place. This time, the laughter was louder and seemed to fill the room. It wasn't from any one direction, but it seemed to fill it. Suddenly, the laughter stopped, and the silence was deafening. Almost more terrifying than the sounds had been, I backed out of the room and closed the door behind me. Jazz was waiting in the hallway, his face pale and drawn. He asked, his voice barely above a whisper, "What did you see?" I said, "Nothing," but it felt like a lie. He nodded as though my statement validated his worst fears. "Even though the bodies are still there, but something is off. Doctor, we need to leave whatever this is. It's not meant for us to understand." I wanted to agree, but I couldn't help myself. "I need to double-check the records," I said. The receptionist was once again sleeping at her desk when I arrived. I hesitated before waking her, unsure of what I was even looking for. I said, "There's something about these children I need to confirm," and she handed it over without a word, her grogginess masking any curiosity. John Ref refused to accompany me, so I made my way back to the reception area alone. The corridor felt endless, with each step echoing menacingly in the silence. My suspicion that the children were siblings from the same family was confirmed when I sat down and looked over the entry. When I thought about their parents not knowing that their children had not only been taken from them, but in such a horrible and unnatural way, I felt sad. When I got back to the morgue, I found Jazz pacing nervously outside the door. He jumped when he saw me. "Doctor." I heard them again, and he said urgently, "The laughter is coming from inside." I sighed, knowing that there was nothing we could do about it, but I said, "We'll go in and we'll see this through." Jazz hesitated, but eventually nodded, and we entered the room. This time, the air was even colder, and a heavy weight seemed to be pressing down on us. The bodies were still in their original location, but the feeling was overwhelming. Then the laughter came back louder and clearer than before, and even though there was no source, it seemed to come from everywhere. Jazz took hold of my arm and held on tightly as I said, "Doctor, they're here." I wanted to argue and come up with a rational explanation, but I was unable to do so because the night's events contradicted everything I knew to be true, seemingly confirming our worst fears. Jazz let out a choked cry and ran for the door. I wanted to follow him, but I was unable to do so because my eyes were fixed on the shadows in the room's corners, which were shifting shapes and moving briefly but unmistakably there. I stood frozen, unable to take my eyes off the shifting shadows that took on the distinct forms of children. They were small, indistinct figures that flickered in and out of clarity as though they were caught between worlds, and their laughter echoed in the light of the room. The three shadows were playful but incredibly unsettling, and they started to move toward the areas where the children's bodies lay. My heart pounded as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figures hovered over the dead forms, their movements nearly in unison. The air felt charged like the instant before a lightning strike, and the room suddenly became colder. The shadows appeared to blend with the bodies on the stretchers, and as I finally mustered the strength to move, I staggered backward toward the door. Suddenly, the laughter stopped, and the room became so quiet that it felt like it was pressing against my ears. The instruments and sheets were still strewn all over the floor, but there was no other indication of any disturbance, and the bodies were lying as they had before the shadows had vanished. Jazz was anxiously pacing outside, waiting for me. The night was far from over, though, because at 4 a.m., as we sat in silence trying to process what had happened, the faint sound of children's voices drifted down the hallway. This time, they weren't laughing, but rather counting as if they were in the middle of a game of hide and seek. When he saw me emerge, his face was pale and drenched in sweat. "What happened in there?" he demanded. I heard the laughter again. "Did you see them?" I nodded, my hands shaking. 1, 2, 3, the face of John, we must now depart. Doctor, as we are twisted in terror. When morning finally came, we went back to the autopsy room to make sure everything was in order before the families arrived. The scene was unnerving. The children's bodies were still where we had left them, but the sheets were still missing and more disturbingly small. I didn't argue. The voices grew louder and seemed to be getting closer. We grabbed our belongings and hurried toward the main hallway as we passed the morgue. But the voices stopped abruptly. The thin layer of dust on the floor showed footprints that circled the areas and led to the door. Jazz gestured toward the footprints. John approached me a few days later with something he had been reluctant to share before I found you in the hallway. He started hesitantly, and I saw them, the children running after me laughing which is why I screamed. I thought they were going to take me, but I looked at him, unsure of what to say. His fear was real, and after what I had witnessed, I couldn't dismiss his experience. His hand was shaking. "Do you see that? Tell me I'm not crazy?" I nodded, my stomach churning. The morgue isn't just a place for the dead. Sometimes it feels like something else is here. "I believe you," I said, and he nodded at last. Relief washed over his face. "I don't think I can do this anymore, Doctor." Jazz quit soon after that conversation, but I stayed because that night had a lasting impression on me. Years later, I can still hear their laughter echoing in my mind. It was the most terrifying experience of my career, and I will always carry that music with me. Those children who were taken too soon played their last game of hide and seek in the morgue, and even though their bodies were buried, a part of them never really left.